Cartoon Network means something different to each of us, depending on what era of the channel you got to live through. A lot of YouTube videos cover a lot of the iconic late 90s and 2010s era of the network, but one area that gets little extensive coverage are the super early years of, as it was once called, the Cartoon Network, or a better way to put it, as we'll soon find out, the DIY years.
Bugs Bunny's still good even without a cell phone.
By the time Cartoon Network launched on October 1st, 1992, the art of television and cable proprietorship was nothing new for Atlanta mega-entrepreneur Ted Turner. He started with TBS in the 70s, then created 24/7 News with CNN in 1980, followed by TNT in 1988. CNN's success was due to the rise in public interest of global news, meaning there was more content to regularly fill 24 hours. And TNT was dependent on the collection of MGM and United Artists films Turner had initially purchased in 1986, but then had to sell back due to debt problems. However, he managed to keep some of those assets and use them to create the library backbone for TNT. Owning all of these materials allowed TNT to keep upfront costs low in the beginning and avoid expensive third-party licensing. Nearly 4 years to the date after the launch of TNT, Ted aimed for the 24/7 format again with another acquired library, Hanna-Barbera. With 8,500 hours of material between Hanna-Barbera and some of the MGM and pre-1948 Merry Melodies cartoons acquired in the MGM sale, it was more than enough to create a 24/7 all-cartoon network. Ted was also a synergetic figure, using all of his employees and networks in tandem to help the others succeed. He chose Senior VP of TNT, Betty Cohen, to be president for the Cartoon Network, and Mike Lazo had worked his way up the ranks at TBS to animation programmer before starting to, as he puts it, help out part-time around Cartoon Network, later becoming the VP of original programming. Lazo's creation Space Ghost Coast to Coast would even use CNN to host interviews to build their episodes around. In these early days, there were times where blocks were simulcasted between TBS, TNT, and Cartoon Network in an effort to get the latest Turner channel going. Turner's acquisition model to build new networks was off and running, but now Cartoon Network faced a greater challenge: finding relevancy with an audience using an aging library and scant funding. But first, let's backtrack and answer a seemingly easy but important question. For whom is a cartoon for? In 1992, American cartoons were at something of a crossroads, somewhere between generic rehashes for kids and rising animated sitcoms. In the 1980s, animation was driven mostly by merchandising and toy sales, with shows like G.I. Joe and He-Man the typical half-hour formulaic adventure series type of cartoons. In 1989, The Simpsons debuted and solidified a place for the modern-day adult animated sitcom that was later replicated on places like MTV with Liquid Television in the 1990s. In 1991, Nickelodeon dropped their first 3 original cartoons, called Nicktoons, that include Rugrats, Doug, and Ren and Stimpy. The standard for airing cartoons was in afternoon blocks after school and Saturday mornings. Now, Cartoon Network was sitting on a stack of oldies, airing 24/7 that was mostly beloved by adults. So to answer for whom a cartoon is for at this time and place would be to say that they were now widely accepted as being for everyone in various changing forms, and now with Cartoon Network availability. Even Ted Turner knew cartoons weren't just for kids, acknowledging that MGM and Merry Melodies cartoons that he initially aired on TNT were mostly watched by adults. So early on, Cartoon Network was able to leverage this adult audience, jumping to #1 in time spent viewing levels by January 1993, indicating they had cable's most loyal audience. But still, they needed more kids to watch to attract lucrative advertisers. Along with the purchase of Hanna-Barbera came their legendary studios as well, though they had fallen on hard times, not having produced a hit since 1981's The Smurfs. Turner appointed advertising expert Fred Siebert, the man responsible for giving MTV its distinct look and feel, to run the company. It would be up to him to steer the ship in a new direction that we'll come back to later on. The late animation historian Jim Korkis posted a timeline of Cartoon Network's first 3 years on the website cartoonresearch.com. Here we get a quick glimpse of everything that came before the dawn of Cartoon Cartoons, which was the true launch of wide-scale original programming and the first golden era for the channel. with the likes of Dexter's Lab, Johnny Bravo, Cow and Chicken, the Powerpuff Girls, Courage the Cowardly Dog, and Ed, Ed and Eddie. Since advertising was needed to get funds for original programming that Ted Turner wasn't willing to dish out right away, these early years did feel largely promotional for the network to reel in young viewers, and it took a very creative effort to get watchers invested in more than just the reruns they aired. Stunts, as Betty Cohen referred to them as, were necessary. Mike Lazo is a native of Georgia, and his accent gives him away instantly. He also looks like the lost member of nearby legendary Athens band REM. The word around Mike is that he's a little strange and quirky, and that's certainly no surprise given he is the mastermind behind the late-night block Adult Swim. But Mike was a guy that thought a lot about TV, so much it seems that it was more akin to an art form than business in how he approached it. Mike once described how these formative years at Cartoon Network were in an interview with IGN. We would sit around every single day in essence because we were just rerunning cartoons. That wasn't that hard to do. I mean, you just said, yeah, air that one again. So every afternoon we'd gather around a table and say, how can we recontextualize these things? We just did all kinds of crazy stuff, you know. Dino, was he a dog or a dinosaur? Let's think really deeply about that and let's ask our viewers. This kind of practice and patience pushed the network to not only use their IP, but find something special within it and make the most of it. Getting creative meant the rulebook was out, and just trying things became the norm. Cartoon Network kicked off with 2 million viewers at launch in 1992. Between then and 1995, things that they just tried included a 1993 Mother's Day Best Mom contest between Wilma Flintstone, Jane Jetson, and Race Bannon. Of course, Race won. June Bugs was a marathon of Bugs Bunny cartoons all throughout the month of June. All 167 episodes of the Flintstones were aired back to back. The Great International Tune-In was a 14-hour marathon aired on all Turner networks in the US, Latin America, and Europe. The never-before-seen pilot for the Flintstones, The Flagstones, aired in 1994 to great press. The Dog Bowl was held in conjunction with the Super Bowl in 1995 that Scooby-Doo won. And finally, World Premiere Toons was announced in 1994. Finally, the sign that the first batch of original cartoons were indeed coming. Now, this time frame wasn't completely devoid of original shows, but again, I'll get to that shortly. While money was being raised and stunts being pushed out, Cartoon Network also started to develop a distinct identity during these years, known as the beginning of the checkerboard era. Crossed somewhere between the classic sentiment of the Disney Channel and the modern debauchery of Nickelodeon, Cartoon Network's personality began to take shape. Think about this. Cartoon Network could have taken an easier, safer route. They could have made Scooby-Doo their Mickey Mouse and stuck to depending on nostalgia to grow. But that would have been too predictable and boring, and possibly could have led it to become the Hanna-Barbera channel and nothing more. But the network refused to submit to this only being who they were. So, as a result, what we got a lot of in this era was creative names and branding around the same old cartoons, but flavorfully repackaged. This included a lot of blocks, anthologies, and marathons like Toonheads, Super Chunk, Down with the Droopy D, Late Night Black and White, 70s Super Explosion, Cartoon Theater, and Toonapalooza, and even some music video compilations here and there. What I found really special were the bumpers that aired in this era. They felt like lively and memorable micro cartoons that were the first thing to head off a program and the last thing you saw after it ended. So you not only remembered the shows, but the channel you were watching them on also left the mark. And over time, the Cartoon Network started to go beyond what Hanna-Barbera had left behind. By the time Cartoon Network turned 3 years old, viewership had risen to 22 million, they had earned an online presence of 500,000 visitors, and heavy hitter advertisers like Hasbro were now on board. It was now time for the final design piece of the puzzle: original cartoons. With a growing identity in place, it was now a matter of getting Hanna-Barbera Studios going. The studio was already sitting on a couple of failures, approved by the newly appointed president, Fred Seibert. At first, Seibert tried doing things by the status quo, and produced 2 cartoon series, Two Stupid Dogs and SWAT Kats: The Radical Squadron, right out of the gate. But both were expensive and commercial failures, though I personally have a soft spot for Two Stupid Dogs. Not to mention, the network swung and missed hard with the novelty of the first live-action cartoon ever made, The Moxie Show. Though this wasn't a Hanna-Barbera production, but rather a brainchild of those at Cartoon Network HQ, so everybody was dropping the ball with original material at first. The typical stale Hanna-Barbera cartoon or gimmicky acts like Moxie were clearly not going to be viable options, so on the Hanna-Barbera side of things, Siebert decided to get to the core philosophy of what a cartoon constituted. He consulted Joe Barbera and William Hanna, who I guess were just conveniently lingering around the studio at this point, and other legends from the industry about how things were done in the old days. It was quite simple. They'd make a cartoon, air it in a theater before a film, and if people liked it, they'd make another. Siebert also used classic cartoons to set some basic guidelines to follow. They should be 7 minutes long, situation, character, and comedy driven, opposed to plot driven, and finally, irreverent in nature. It was the perfect approach for creating new cartoons, using the knowledge and wisdom of old guard animators to attract new animators who had grown up watching classic cartoons to work alongside in a mentor-mentee fashion and replicate their craft for a new generation. The animation industry itself had grown overcomplicated with writers holding most of the control in the creation process, while outsourcing the rest to a factory line of animators. That would no longer be the case at Hanna-Barbera Studios, though. As Siebert planned an anthology series to air, they decided to take only physical pitches from animators over writers. And instead of buying these works up front, they let animators keep their work if they decided to pass, which irritated some as this definitely wasn't the norm at the time. Siebert went on to say regarding young animators in an interview with the Dot and Line, what were in their heads were the kind of cartoons they grew up with, that generally were old cartoons, because all new animation was basically half-hour sitcoms or adventure shows. Nobody in 1993 or in 1995 knew what a cartoon was anymore. They knew what animation was, but here I was saying, I want a cartoon. I set up parameters, 7 minutes, and that was a dog whistle to traditionalists. Oh, he really means it, he wants cartoons, not animated sitcoms. Instead of dropping $10 million on another SWAT Cats, Siebert decided this entire budget would be used to produce 48 shorts that would make up the anthology series, World Premiere Toons, later known as the What a Cartoon Show. The anthology was first announced in January 1994, and the studio quickly received 5,000 pitches. And since Cartoon Network didn't have a standards and practices department, anything they found to be good would get made, with little cautionary tape holding them back. Meanwhile, those back in Atlanta were coming up with something new themselves. Mike Lazo's brainstorming sessions would eventually lead them to think about what modern topics they could cash in on. At this time, there were the late-night talk show wars going on, and that became the canvas on which Space Ghost Coast to Coast was conceived, first airing in April 1994. Reinventing Hanna-Barbera cartoons for a new generation was nothing new, but taking a bizarre and forgotten washed-up character like Space Ghost and putting him at the forefront of a completely off-the-wall premise as a talk show host was a brilliant, cheap way to make something from what was just lying around collecting dust. Not only did it keep a certain tongue-in-cheek brand allegiance to Hanna-Barbera, but it reaffirmed to their audience that it wasn't taking their IP too seriously. In fact, they were willing to rewrite it altogether, and the show quickly became popular with viewers. Space Ghost was also comprised of short episodes, staying congruent with what was being built over at Hanna-Barbera Studios. Together, animators active from all the way back in the 50s, and new and up-and-comers worked hand-in-hand to create cartoons, establishing some notable animator names like Genndy Tartakovsky, Craig McCracken, Butch Hartman, Seth MacFarlane, and Zach Moncrief in the process. World Premiere Toons finally debuted in February 1995, simultaneously on TBS, TNT, and the Cartoon Network. The first episode to air was the Powerpuff Girls short, Meet Fuzzy Lumpkins, announcing to the world that finally something was cooking over at the network. 4 shorts would be selected to go to full series from the final 48, which all became staples of that aforementioned golden era: Dexter's Lab, the Powerpuff Girls, Johnny Bravo, and Cow and Chicken. And just to reiterate how little they thought of any semblance of boundaries in regards to risky material, please watch the Cow and Chicken What a Cartoon episode, No Smoking. The red guy goes plainly by the devil and sends Chicken to hell to torture him by making him smoke cigarettes. This is one of the shorts they selected to go to full series. I know they would tame the series down, but still, do I need to say more? What a Cartoon really became the watershed moment for the network, as it now had a reliable product in place for kids. Whether it felt like something classic or suggestively raunchy, the anthology series was like a mini film festival for kids that were undeniably fun, full of predominantly physical and wacky comedy, and as a result, inarguably cartoons. Hanna-Barbera Studios would eventually become Cartoon Network Studios, a legendary studio in its own right that just in the past couple years closed its own doors to merge with Warner Animation. Between these new cartoons and Space Ghost, the rulebook had truly been rewritten in the image of what Cartoon Network decided it wanted to be. And the philosophy developed by those people internally of just trying things would long prove fruitful for the network going forward. I think that's why when blocks like Toonami later popped up, it didn't feel strange to place someone like Moltar as the host initially, even though his original version doesn't come to mind for that certain aesthetic. But it didn't matter because Moltar could fit anywhere in the now established Cartoon Network aesthetic. Now, Toonami doesn't fall into the 1992 to 1995 years, but this was another example of Cartoon Network using just what was lying around, like old episodes of Voltron, for instance, that they could then just figure out what was cool and design an aesthetic around it before figuring out what really worked, which was anime. Now, I don't think I really need to mention that Adult Swim's entire existence revolves around the cheap, just trying things philosophy and model, but Mike Lazo does attribute the early broke developmental years of Cartoon Network to how it came about. In 1996, Time Warner acquired Turner Entertainment, and Cartoon Network became a household name with a massive viewer base. But there was still some of that anarchistic thinking going on by those that still remained at the network since the beginning, as they realized there was a huge number of adults still watching TV into the late hours of the night. This not only opened the doors for non-kid friendly advertisers to have a presence on the network, but it also swept the slate clean to just start trying things and see what works in a new arena. Even in a position of stability, Cartoon Network still left space to rewrite the rules for themselves, just as they had done in those early startup years. To this day, as networks have turned their focus to streaming and cable subscribers continue to plummet, it is the opinion of many that Adult Swim has overtaken the network as its strongest pull. And I believe that somewhere along the way, the philosophy that Cartoon Network lived by during those pre-acquisition years continued to evolve and be exercised primarily through Adult Swim, which shows placing creativity over everything else does pay off in the long run, at least in my unqualified opinion. From humble Ted Turner brainchild to a childhood pillar for millions around the world, Cartoon Network has proven time and time again that just trying things has always been a part of its essential DNA. And I hope you've enjoyed this story. Don't litter. Take care.